Yo, what's going on, Titan Clan? It is your local narcissist here, King Titan X here, back with another video. And let's get this video started. Alright, we're going to be doing What If Deku Was Soldier Boy. And I know what you guys are thinking, the rapper? Nah, we're talking about Soldier Boy from, not the comics, but the Amazon TV show. You know, the actual good version of Soldier Boy. Because in the comics, there's like 3 different iterations of Soldier Boy, and the latest edition of Soldier Boy in the comics is just this man peed his pants in like the comic book cover. I'm pretty sure nobody wants to hear that iteration of Soldier Boy. But yeah, let's get on to the video. 80% of this world's population have been born with this thing known as quakes, this phenomenon that seemed to have happened a good couple hundred years ago. With this new thing known as quakes, people have created a new profession, which is known as heroes. Heroes are essentially exactly what it sounds like. People who go around saving people using their superpowers. These are apparently like the main licensed people to use their quirks as well within the society. Sure, you can have some people who are police officers or something using their quirks as well, but for the most part, it was the heroes who had the limelight. They became celebrities of sorts. They often made a lot of money from marketing, from just being able to save people. They had a lot of merchandise as well. You could sell a lot of products with these super powered individuals. People that were seen as bigger than life, essentially, especially people like All Might within this world. Many people aspire to be just like these superheroes, but most of the time they just did not get the luck of the draw. Getting a quirk was basically like the lottery. Sometimes you can be born with a very strong quirk, other times you would just be born with a pretty average or mediocre quirk. Say you had someone that could control the elements. That would be considered a really strong quirk, especially if you could generate a whole lot of it. Now, you could have 2 individuals actually when it came on to controlling the elements. You could have a person who could create glaciers essentially with this ability to control ice. Another person, they could only create ice cubes. That was the extent of their quirk. Now you can definitely see which one would become a hero and which one would just become an office clerk. That was the whole issue with quirks. And then you also had 20% of the population. 20% of the population I actually want to focus on though, because they are the ones who are quirkless. They are seen as below most people. Most people see them as less than human sometimes. Well, it's like this. Quirked individuals, they are seen as a regular people. 20% of the population are considered the minority, the people who were not blessed with quirks, and therefore they are seen as less capable overall. You would have to be extremely well in your profession. You would have to do miracles or whatever when you are a quirkless individual in order to, well, even be considered noteworthy within this world of quirks, or even just a typical person. You have to go above and beyond to prove your usefulness in this world. If you are born quirkless, your life is 10 times harder if you are quirkless. Especially if you are thinking about being a hero. The most you could ever be when trying to become a hero is a police officer. And even then, trying to become a police officer in the world of quirks when you are quirkless is incredibly risky as well. Most of the time the heroes will be the ones to handle the villains, or at least like take them down, and the police are the ones to arrest them. But sometimes these villains would just escape from captivity, and then the police officers, they would be the ones responsible for catching them again. And if you're quirkless, it's pretty understandable why that would be an issue. Especially, if you're dealing with somebody who has a gigantification quirk, an elemental control quirk, they're able to produce fire, they're able to control the wind, or they just have telekinesis or super strength. And you are quirkless. You literally only have the strength of a regular human. The most you can actually do is just go by the sidelines, try and create a trap or something. You can't use your own physical strength against these guys. Now, sure, in this world of quirks, you are considered to be a bit stronger than the humans a couple hundred years ago. You see within the show some humans, even though they may be quirkless at times, shown doing some unusual feats, you could say. For example, not even for example, you can look at people like Stain, who, although they do have quirks, you see that they don't have, physical quirks, something like super strength or super speed. No, their quirks don't rely on their power whatsoever, their physical strength or anything. They have to build up that strength over time, but yet they're able to do incredible feats. Now the issue is when you literally are just a regular human, you don't even have anything else. Sure, you can maybe use your weapons, but even then, what are you going to do against the guys who are able to just knock your head out? Some people who are like building level, people who are able to literally just punch down buildings, for crying out loud. How are you going to handle these sort of people when all you can do is lift a fridge? Lift like 200 pounds. Sure, you can be like peak human condition or whatever, but in the world of quirks, you need to have a lot more than just that in order to make it out there, in order to actually survive. If we want to be on that sort of field, if we want to be on the front lines. That's why most quirkless individuals are seen as less than, because they know that these quirkless individuals are more fragile than the ones with quirks, or at least the good quirks anyways. Those people that were born with just bad quirks, such as only being able to pull your eyes out to your eye sockets for a little bit, or able to stretch your fingers out a little bit. They're just considered to be a bit above quirkless individuals. They're not seen as much, really. But with all of these difficulties that quirkless individuals had, there would be this one quirkless man who throughout the years, he would have noticed how quirks continued to be evolving, and he wanted in on that action. Although he wasn't able to have a quirk himself, he decided to create a chemical. Throughout the years, this was actually in the beginning of the quirk era, you could say. This man, he decided to create something he would like to call Compound V. And over the years, he would have been experimenting on this chemical until eventually he was able to finally come up with the correct dosage, come up with the correct version in order to bestow upon people quirks. This Compound V, its whole process of being made would be passed on throughout the years. Even after the man's death, he would have made sure that chemicals spread. So those who were born in a minority, they would have been given a chance to also have quirks. That, and he also wanted to create his own super soldiers of sorts, but that didn't have to be known. He would have basically created his own sort of legacy. This man's name was known as Vought. Well, at least that would have just been his name that most people would have recognized. His last name, Vought, that's pretty much the only name that people would recognize throughout the years. And he would have even had a company named after him, which specialized in pharmaceuticals, especially with Compound V. They would have passed on this dosage throughout the years, and they would have also created a good amount of superheroes. But even with all of these superheroes, they still didn't stack up to some of the top 10 heroes, top 20, 30, 40, 50, top 50 heroes within Japan, the US, all of these different countries. They were trying to create something. They were trying to create something grand. And this is where Izuku would come in. You see, Izuku's father, Hisashi Midoriya, he actually worked for Vought in America. Hisashi needed to provide for his family, so he ended up going to America. He was living in America, and he was making an income in America by working for Vought. He was making a pretty good amount of money, actually, working for all of these superheroes, this large pharmaceutical company, and he was sending a good amount of money back to his family in Japan. But Vought would eventually find out that he had a son. His name was Izuku, and he was quirkless. Hisashi Midoriya, on the other hand, he actually did have a quirk. He had the ability to breathe fire, which wasn't all that remarkable, but it was at least something. And his wife, Inko Midoriya, she also had a quirk. Her quirk was basically, well, sort of telekinesis. A very, very weak version of telekinesis, only able to really pick up something similar to a toy or whatever. But when it came on to Vought, they would see an opportunity in Izuku. They would mention how, hey, you should definitely bring your son around here. The higher ups would actually bring Hisashi into their office one day, mentioning how they wanted to have a little experiment on Izuku. They understood that his son was quirkless, and they had also heard stories about him getting bullied. They were compassionate people. That was the whole reason why they were even making these superpowered individuals in the first place, in order to have it to where the quirkless people, they would also be given a fair chance at life. They were born dealt a bad hand, or it's like this. Quirkless people are basically dealt a bad hand in life from birth. That wasn't their fault. So with Vought's logic, why not have it to where these quirkless individuals could actually gain quirks of their own? Why not have it to where everybody has a fair chance at life? Why is it that 80% of the population is allowed to have quirks and 20% isn't? It didn't make much sense in their minds. So they were willing to offer up a free dosage to Hisashi Midoriya to give to his son Izuku Midoriya in Japan. In actuality, Vought was just using this as a marketing strategy. If they could make a hero in Japan, and they can market him incredibly well, then that would actually be very well for them. Especially if they could bring this kid to America. They needed to have some more foreign people within their group. they had this group known as Payback. They were an upcoming team, you could say, but the whole issue with Payback was that they weren't really all that diverse. It was mainly like a bunch of white people. Well, no, that's actually kind of racist. Well, basically it's like this. You had some Caucasians, maybe you had like some black people in there as well, and Mexican or two, or like some Spanish people, whatever. I'm not trying to offend anybody here. I'm just saying, like, the group was just made up of like the basic couple of people, but they wanted to expand. Essentially, they wanted to expand their group or groups, and they wanted to expand them to the point where it would include people of even Japanese origin. That's where Izuku would come in. They would have handed Hisashi a dosage, and they would mention how he should just go to Japan and deliver the dosage to his son directly. It would basically be a good gift, you could say. They would even have him on a paid vacation to Japan. Hisashi, hearing this, he would feel kind of honored. He honestly did feel like this was going to be a great opportunity for his son, so he would take the opportunity and deliver the dosage to his son. He would be sent to Japan, on a paid flight actually, to Japan, by, well, Vought. Vought would have actually paid for all of his expenses, and he would have came to his home in Japan where his family was. He would have knocked on the door, and Inko would have been surprised to see Hisashi home so soon. It was usually when it was something similar to Christmas in America or like a holiday in America that Hisashi would come by to see them. But that wasn't the case for today for some reason. But Hisashi would mention that he had an opportunity for Izuku to get a quake. Inko would have been a bit skeptical. She would have been confused as to what Hisashi was trying to say, but Hisashi would explain that the company he works for, Vought, they specialize in pharmaceuticals. And within these pharmaceuticals, there's this thing known as Compound V. Compound V is something that essentially allows for individuals to, gain quirks. 80% of the population, they already have quirks. And Vought's reasoning is that it's not fair for only 80% of the population to have quirks. If there are people in this world who are born quirkless and they don't want to be quirkless, then by all means they shouldn't have to be treated as second-class citizens. If they really want to be treated as the same as everybody else, then they would need to have a quirk for some reason. Although it was poor logic it was pretty poor logic in Vought's mind that people without quirks are treated like second-class citizens. They can't really change that, but what they could change is their status. That's where Compound V will come in. They would sell Compound V or like deliver Compound V to quirkless individuals so that they could gain quirks of their own, and for once they could finally fit in. Now, Compound V was usually delivered to infants. It was usually seen as, well, safer for infants to have Compound V injected into their bloodstream. But when it came on to at least teenagers, they could work as well. It was mainly when it came onto adults that it became an issue because of like their advanced physiology. They wouldn't have as much time to adapt, you could say. So by the time Izuku was 14, His father would inject this strange chemical into into his back, his lower back. It was painful at first, but Hisashi would mention that this would be for his own good. This would be for Izuku's own good. He would actually thank him in the future for doing this to him as well. Izuku was hesitant to believe this at first, but he trusted his dad. His dad did know best. So Izuku would go through with the injection, despite how painful it was, all the way through. His dad would just console him the whole time, until the process was through with, and Izuku's eyes, they would glow for a bit. He started to feel not really all that different actually. He felt pretty normal at first, but it was only after a week that things started to change for Izuku. You see, Bakugo, he would have been on his bullying campaign once again. Bakugo always bullied Izuku for the fact that he was quirkless, and Izuku, he couldn't really do much against it. He despised that fact. He despised the fact that he was quirkless, and he could never do anything to stop Bakugo. Even when he tried when he was little, he only ever got beat up even worse than before. Izuku had to learn his place essentially, but after a week of torment, when he got that compound re-injected into him, Izuku, he started to feel a bit more confident for some weird reason. For some reason today, he felt as if he could take on the world. He felt as if Bakugo wasn't going to bully him any longer. He was going to put an end to this right here and right now. He would stand up to Bakugo for once today, after all these years of just taking this torment, taking all of this bullying. And Bakugo, he would just laugh at Izuku, thinking that this kid was stupid. But Izuku, he would sucker punch Bakugo, and this punch, Bakugo would actually feel it. Bakugo's jaw just dislodged for a second, and he would be in shock and pain. He would have actually been sent to the hospital, and Izuku would have been suspended for a couple weeks actually. Izuku wouldn't even be all that upset though. He wouldn't be upset over the fact that they allow Bakugo to just get away scot-free for all of this bullying he did, but yet the one time that Izuku actually defended himself, that's the time he gets in trouble. No, he wasn't mad at all. Nah, he was more excited than anything. You see, he just awakened his quirk. He had super strength. It seemed that that chemical that his father injected into him that week ago actually seemed to work. It seemed to have finally kicked in all of a sudden. Izuku was feeling stronger. He felt more capable of himself. He was feeling more confident. He was excited. He was ecstatic actually. He felt as if he could take on the world now. He realized that he could become a superhero. Just like All Might. He could be just like All Might. And that's what really got to him. When Izuku came back to school after those couple weeks of being suspended, many people would be looking at Izuku differently. Many people would even have rumors. They would be whispering to each other, talking about how Izuku just plugged Bakugo in the jaw just a couple weeks ago, and that left him in the ER. That left Bakugo in the ER. It made no sense to a lot of them. They thought that Izuku was quirkless. But now all of a sudden Izuku was coming in with super strength, enough to take Bakugo, the strongest kid in their class, the strongest kid in their school actually. He took him down. That was amazing in many of their eyes. That was, it was unbelievable actually. Bakugo, he would have also been back at school at this point, and he would have been glaring daggers at Izuku. He believed that Izuku had been lying about about not having a quirk for so many years, just so that he could embarrass him that one time. He let Izuku. No, what am I saying? He was under the belief that Izuku was lying about being quirkless for so many years, just so that he could embarrass Bakugo later on, far in the future, for whatever reason. And Bakugo, he hated Izuku for that. He wanted to get his revenge on Izuku, especially for what he did to his jaw. He was still struggling right now when it came on to eating. He had to still drink from a straw. He still had to drink from a straw for like these next couple of weeks. He had to wait until like 4 months in order to be allowed to, eat properly again because of what Izuku did to him. Mitsuki, she wanted to press charges, but at the same time, Inko would have had Izuku make an apology. Although Izuku would also mention the fact that Bakugo had been bullying him for the longest now. That was the whole reason he even got into a fight with Bakugo in the first place. Mitsuki wouldn't believe it at first, but the way Izuku described it, it sounded so in character for his son. And Katsuki, he would have just been aghast. He would have looked over to his mother, and she would have actually been furious at Bakugo now. They would be looking at each other, and Mitsuki would apologize for what happened to Izuku throughout these years, for him to end up in such a way, for him to act so violently towards her son. Granted, what Bakugo did as well was irredeemable. As a matter of fact, she needed to punish Bakugo as well. Well, what Izuku did was practically punishment already. This may be what's going to humble Bakugo for the forthcoming future, you could say. Or at least that was Mitsuki's hopes during that time. But in the present time that we're focusing on right now, Izuku just wouldn't have felt very different from how he was before. Like I said before, he was more confident. He was all of a sudden very popular for some reason. Many people were basically looking up to Izuku at this point. They were basically seeing Izuku as an underdog, the guy who finally awakened his quirk and taught Bakugo a lesson. Izuku liked this attention. He liked it a lot. He could actually get used to it. And the teacher would one day even mention the fact that both Izuku and Bakugo, they were trying to get into UA. Many people, when they heard this, they didn't really say anything. Well, they did say that they had high hopes in Izuku when it came on to him making it into UA. When Bakugo screamed at the fact that he was also going to be making it into UA, or as a matter of fact, he was going to be the only one that was going to make it into UA. Many people, they would be like, yeah, Bakugo does seem like a very likely candidate to make it into UA. But Izuku, he for sure is probably going to make it into UA. Bakugo, he has the flashiness aspect. He has the flashiness of his quirk being explosions. He has more versatility, you could say. But in terms of just pure raw strength, Izuku just had that. That was the main thing Izuku had over Bakugo. Pure raw strength and speed. That was the main thing Izuku had. And he was even training at times as well. Always upping his strength and speed. Trying to always make sure that he was ahead of everybody. Considering how big of a disadvantage he had over everybody else. He needed to catch up with everybody. He only had his quirk for just a couple months at this point. He needed to train even harder than before if he wanted to make into UA. If he wanted to become a hero, then Well, just having a strong quirk wasn't going to be it. He needed to train this quirk. He needed to master this quirk. He needed to master his strength and speed if he was going to ever be anything sort of similar to All Might. He wanted to have that sort of fame for himself. He was getting all of this attention from his classmates and his middle school, but he wanted even more attention now. He understood where Bakugo was coming from. He admired the attention. The attention was addicting, but he was also becoming a bit of a jerk, you could say, when it came onto this attention. He was a glory hog. He wanted all his attention for himself, and he would basically even have some backlash towards some people who tried to even remotely try and upstage him. Anybody that tried to show that they were also capable, Izuku would easily humble them back down with violence, you could say. Izuku was getting more abusive in terms of his relationships with the students at the school, more abusive than Bakugo ever was. Many people would actually become fearful of Izuku for that fact. Many people who knew Izuku personally, they honestly didn't have the best sort of relationship. They didn't really like Izuku, but they tolerated him because of the fact that they knew they couldn't do anything against him. What were they going to do against a kid that could literally just break your jaw in one punch? What were they going to do? What? Chew him out? And then what? And get their brains splattered all across the floor? Yeah, no, they knew better. They knew better than to actually risk trying to talk to Izuku about his attitude. Even the teachers knew better. They tried to suspend him on multiple occasions, but that didn't seem to do anything. It only seemed to bolster Izuku's confidence even more each and every time. It's because of the fact that these people, they tried to detain him, tried to control him. And that's the main issue. Every time they tried to control him, it would always end up backfiring on them because Izuku would come back 10 times worse. He refused to basically be controlled. He wanted to become a celebrity. And that's exactly what he was going to get. First, he was going to make it into UA. Then he was going to train extra hard in order to make sure that nobody surpassed him. Anybody that did try, he would show them where their real place was on the pecking order. And then he would go on to become the #1 hero of Japan. Or maybe even the world, become a worldwide celebrity or something. When he actually looked at his powers as well, and compared them to All Might, they seem to be rather similar. It's just that he needed to become even stronger. For the next 10 months, that's exactly what Izuku would have been doing. He would have been training his butt off in order to increase his super strength and speed. He also wanted to increase his durability. Well, there wasn't really much he could do about that, to be honest, considering he was already bulletproof, which is something above most people within this world. Most people already seem to have like some form of super strength in comparison to people from before quirks, but Izuku's super strength was to the point where he could easily lift 600 pounds with one arm. Casually, I should say. He could literally just walk around with 600 pounds on one arm at every moment of the day, and he would feel no fatigue from it whatsoever. He wanted to increase that to 1200. Although he would only be able to increase it to about 900 to like 1000 by the end of the 10 months, which, although incredible, it's still not what he found to be necessary. He wanted to keep rising up in terms of numbers every single moment. He wanted to always keep improving so that he would never be left behind. He never wanted to be that quirkless, weak Deku again. He despised that version of himself with all of his person. He despised that person with all of his heart. He never wanted to go back there because he felt so weak, so alone. But now he felt popular. He was actually popular for once in his life. And he wasn't about to just let that go so easily. He wasn't about to let go of this opportunity that his father and bought got for him. Or, well, gave to him. He wasn't about to just waste it whatsoever. That's exactly why he trained so hard during those 10 months. So that he would make sure he was a shoe-in for UA. Sure, he was already confident in his abilities, but he didn't know which sort of competition he had to deal with. Especially when it came on to people who had their quirks for like 10 plus years. Well, Izuku, although he was no slouch, he only had his quirk for about a year at this point. When the UA entrance exams finally rolled around, Izuku would have felt as if he was ready. He was actually extremely confident in his abilities at this point, and he would have just been sitting rather smug throughout the whole time while listening to President Mike talk about what they had to deal with. Izuku would be interested, finding out that they had to fight robots for the practical part of the exam, and Izuku, he was already capable of punching through steel, so that wasn't really much of an issue for him. So this was what Izuku would end up doing throughout most of that battle. As soon as the gates opened up, Izuku would have rushed in before everybody else. Many people call out Izuku for rushing in before President Mike even called time, but President Mike would actually agree with Izuku's philosophy. Nobody was going to tell you when a fight was about to emerge or commence. So, as soon as you see the gates open up, you should immediately go rushing in. There is no countdown in a real battle, so they should follow Izuku. Many of the kids, they would immediately rush in, hoping to get some points as well. But Izuku, he already would have taken down a couple of pointers. He would have taken down a 1-pointer, and he would have also taken out like 3 2-pointers. That would have been like 6 points in total for like those 2-pointers. And he would have also taken down 1 3-pointer. He would have also been using he would have actually been using one of the like metal plates from one of the robots in order to use as a shield for whenever he was fighting them. He would be fighting each and every last one of the robots. He would have been taking them down like they were child's play. He would have been seen massacring these robots by leaping onto them, ripping out their circuits, throwing them to the floor, and he would actually grab a couple by the feet and just throw them into each other. Many kids would be amazed at Izuku's strength, and they would have been wondering what sort of capabilities, or like what sort of quirk Izuku had. Many people would assume super strength, which they wouldn't be all that far off with, but that wouldn't be all that he really had. Izuku would have also been seen not just rushing into some of the robots. Many kids would be surprised. At first they thought he had super strength, but then seeing him literally just charge into some of the robots, just rush through some of the robots, and not even have any sort of scar on him, no sort of injury whatsoever, they would have been questioning if he also had some sort of hardening quirk or whatever. Did his skin just seem to be all that durable, or what? They were confused. What sort of quirk did this madman have? Izuku was just running in wild, and through the cameras, like the evaluation room, many teachers would be looking at Izuku, and they would have seen him as an interesting prospect for a student this year. They would have also been looking at Bakugo and his performance during the entrance exam, and they would have realized that both Bakugo and Izuku were madmen, essentially. And they would have also found out that these two came from the same school. They were they were wondering what kind of school this was. What kind of school could raise such freaks of nature? By the end, Izuku and Bakugo, they would have had similar scores. But what's also interesting is the fact that neither one of them ended up getting any hero points. Well, not hero points, but like rescue points. Izuku would have gotten some rescue points if he decided to save that one girl from the 0-pointer, but he decided against it. He realized that he was already a bit too drained, and he was a bit too drained from, well, fighting all of these robots for 10 minutes straight. He needed to work on that. He needed to work on, well, all of these different issues. He would just constantly find flaws within himself and try to work on them so that he would be above the rest no matter what. So he needed to work on his endurance. Since his endurance could only seem to last for so long, he'd never actually been in real combat like that after all. The 0-pointer robot would have been called off before they got too close from Ochakra, so it was alright. And by the end of the entrance exam, Izuku, well, obviously Izuku would have passed, just without any rescue points. Izuku would have had around 81 points, while Bakugo had 77 points. The only reason that Izuku had a slightly higher score than Bakugo was because of the fact that he had such an incredible amount of super strength. Bakugo, he just had a lot more range with his quirk. That was the reason why they had such similar scores. Izuku had incredible super strength but not a whole lot of range. Bakugo didn't have as powerful of an ability as Izuku, but he had more range than Izuku. So that was why the scores were so close. Izuku just rushing into some of these robots, crashing into them, just busting out the side and all that. That was what was the main reason why Izuku was able to stay ahead. Izuku felt as if he had already managed to win his fight into UA, and he would be absolutely correct in this belief because like a couple weeks later he would actually get a letter in the mail, and it would basically be a hologram of Nezu welcoming Izuku into UA. Izuku would be pleased to hear this, and he would also end up meeting a bunch of new people when he finally arrived at UA. He would have been in his UA uniform and everything, and he would meet a couple of people, but he wasn't really all that concerned with them. He just saw them as classmates and stepping stones as well. People that could potentially get in his way of becoming number one if he were to just slip up. He knew that he was dealing with the best of the best in terms of how strong their quirks were, or at least that's what he suspected. Some of them he wasn't all that sure about, but he understood that when it came on to that, well, quirk evaluation thing that was happening with UA during the entrance exams, it had to mean that these kids had to be proficient enough with their quirks in order to make it into UA, or else why would they even be here? A top-notch hero high school like UA, you had to be some of the very best, top 1% or something. And that's why Izuku prided himself so much on making it into UA. It was like a monument or something. That's basically the way Izuku saw it, although some treated it even more importantly than others, considering how as soon as he walked into the class, he saw this blue-haired boy with glasses reprimanding Bakugo for putting his feet on the table. Izuku would actually look at Bakugo and glare before actually walking over to Ida and Bakugo as well. He would also reprimand Bakugo for putting his feet on the table and actually slap him right across the face. Bakugo would have been angered by this and tell Izuku what's his problem. He would be roaring in fury, but Izuku, he would just slap Bakugo again, mentioning how, oh, cheer up, don't be such a sorry powder, whatever. All this kid is asking for you to do is to just put your feet down. After all, you were at high school such as UA. This is a very prestigious high school. Treat the place with some respect. That's essentially what Izuku would have been saying to Bakugo. And Bakugo, knowing that he couldn't really do much of anything, he would actually sit down properly this time. Aizawa would have heard all of this commotion, and he would have actually gotten up as well from his sleeping bag. He would introduce himself as Shota Aizawa, and this class has been loud for far too long. It took them like 8 seconds to actually quiet down, for crying out loud. That wasn't going to work in the hero world. Izuku liked Aizawa's attitude. He was a no-nonsense sort of dude. He could get behind that. Aizawa was so no-nonsense, as a matter of fact, that he wouldn't even have his kids go to the annual ceremony for the newest members of UA or anything. Rather Aizawa would actually have the kids do a quick evaluation test and go outside to the PE area and dress up in their PE uniforms as well. Chaco would have mentioned how they should also have been going to the annual ceremony, but Aizawa would have mentioned that there is no time for that. This school prides itself on the fact that teachers are allowed to teach the way they want, and therefore, if Aizawa wants to skip out on the ceremony, then he has all right to do so, because there are far more important things to deal with than some stupid ceremony. What these kids need to deal with is actually getting a feel for their quigs. Because of the fact that their schools, they were usually trying to suppress the usage of your quig, try and make it feel as if everybody is equal. But that is just not the case at all. Nobody is equal in this world. Nobody is given same. Nobody is dealt the same hand in life. Essentially, Izuku would have heard every word that Aizawa was saying, and he would be agreeing with it. He absolutely agreed with Aizawa's methodology, because of the fact that he had to go through that as well. He had to go through all of this throughout life. He understood what it was like to be powerful and to be weak. He had basically been living on both sides of the equation, so he knew exactly what it felt like. He understood what Aizawa was saying, and when they went to do the quirk evaluation test, Izuku would have actually been the first one up, because of the fact that Izuku managed to get the highest score on the entrance exam, which Bakugo would have been angry about, but he remembered the slap he just got like an hour ago from Izuku, and he would just bite his tongue in furiosity, knowing that he couldn't really do much against Izuku right now. He would just save it for another day. He would just need to get stronger is all. But Izuku, he would essentially throw the ball into the atmosphere, and he would have basically thrown it out of orbit. Or at least, yeah, he would have just thrown it out of orbit. Many people would be impressed by Izuku's score, wondering just how strong Izuku really was. And Aizawa would actually mention how he was actually going to not suspend, but actually expel one of these kids, kick them out of Class 1A, kick them out of the hero course if they can't perform good enough. If somebody makes it to last place, whoever makes it into last place, they were going to get expelled from UA, essentially. That's basically what Azawa was going to tell these kids in order to make sure that they did their very hardest. That they did their very best, because of the fact that he heard one of the kids saying, "Oh, we get to use our quakes in this? Oh, this seems so fun." He heard all of that excitement, and he realized that if he didn't tell them this, then nothing was really going to get done. He needed to threaten them with expulsion if he wanted to see their very best results, see their true potential. And the Suzuku kid was already seeming to be part of the cream of the crop, you could say. Throughout most of the competitions, Izuku will just dominated each and every last one of them. Well, besides a couple. You see something like the speed, the 50-meter dash, I should say. You see, Ida would have dominated that one. Izuku would have been like top 3 though. Izuku would have been in the top 3 in terms of speed, but he wasn't able to make it into first place for that one. Most of the other Suzuku was able to dominate in though. And by the end of Zuku, he would have ended up even getting up to first place, which impressed many of the kids. This would actually also infuriate Bakugo even more. And then there was this kid who got 20th place. His name was Manetta, and his quirk seemed to just be sticky balls or whatever. Basically, he was able to dislodge these purple balls from his head, which apparently were very sticky for everybody else if they were to touch it. But the way he used his quake, honestly, like, Zuko really did not care for this kid whatsoever. He didn't feel bad for this kid. In all honesty, Zuko didn't even think that Manetta deserved to be part of UA with how pathetic his quake really was. Even when looking at this girl, Invisible Girl, Toru Hagakure, he was wondering what was so special about her. Like, sure, she was invisible, but it didn't even seem like she could turn that off, which was weird. There was also this tail guy. Literally, his whole quirk was that he just had a tail. Izuku was confused as to why some of these guys managed to make it into UA when he had to work his butt off in order to make it into UA. It seemed as if UA was just accepting anybody and everybody now. It actually kind of upset Izuku a little bit with how some of these kids had such pathetic looking quirks. At least with some of the kids though, they had interesting enough quirks. One kid was able to harden his skin. She was able to create acid. Another girl, actually, she was literally able to create items from her body fat. Izuku found that these quirks were worthy of UA. Yeah, these were the sort of quirks that were worthy of being in UA. Not these secondhand quirks, not these secondhand quirk users. Literally sticky balls, being able to be invisible the whole time, and then there's just this one guy with a tail. Nah, in Izuku's opinion, all 3 of these guys should have been expelled from the UA. These guys should have never made it into UA in the first place. That was the way Izuku was looking at it. And then there was this one kid, Oyama. He seemed to just have this one laser quirk, this naval laser quirk, where he was able to use it, but only for 1 second at a time. If he was able to use it for longer, then okay, maybe he could be part of UA. That seemed to be a kind of cool enough quirk, but 1 second? Really? And then you have a tummy ache? That's it? How are you going to help on the front lines? Nah, Izuku refused to believe that some of these kids were even able to make it into UA. It made no sense to Izuku. It seemed as if they didn't try hard enough, or that they were just born with the bad hands, but yet they were somehow seen better than Azuku was at first. It didn't make much sense. Like, for you to have quirks like this, and then to say a quirk this person couldn't make it into UA, was basically an insult to Azuku at this point. To make matters worse, Aizawa allowed this kid, Mineta, to stay in Class 1A because he showed some potential or whatever? No! No, he didn't! That's at least what Izuku was seeing. This kid showed nothing remarkable whatsoever. He was literally staring at girls most of the time. And this guy was literally just letting his hormones run wild most of the time when he should have actually been training or like actually taking this quirk evaluation test seriously. So this was basically an insult to injury, or adding salt to injury or whatever. And Izuku's book, that's the way Izuku was seeing it. He hated this. At first he thought he could understand Aizawa, but no. Now Aizawa was completely losing him. But he also heard that All Might was going to be a teacher at UA the very next day. This would interest Izuku, although he would also be finding out how the UA curriculum seemed to work as well. He was surprised to see how many heroes were actually teachers at UA, and he realized he could make a lot of connections here at UA. He admired this, and when he found out that All Might was going to be that teacher, this excited Izuku. He was finally going to meet the man and see just how much room he still had to grow if he ever wanted to surpass All Might. Izuku would have ended up finding out from All Might, who was apparently his teacher now, that they were going to be doing hero combat. They were going to be practicing combat? Interesting. Izuku did have to actually work on his endurance a little bit, so this was actually going to be interesting for Izuku. This was actually going to excite Izuku a little bit, because this is something that he was trying to work on for the longest now. But although he was able to increase his speed and his strength, he wasn't really able to increase his endurance that much, besides like just carrying a bunch of weight on himself. But when it came on to like how he moved, and fighting and running were very different. Fighting and running, they were very different things essentially. So Izuku was excited to deal with that. They would end up getting some hero uniforms as well. They would have actually had it to wear, well, I don't know how to describe it. Basically what ended up happening is that when it came on to hero costumes as well, the kids will be allowed to wear their hero costumes this time around, which Izuku had already made a sketch for and sent the design over to like UA's support department a while back. So this was going to be the first time that Izuku was going to be wearing his hero uniform, and he was excited for that. And yeah, I'm going to be completely honest, his hero outfit is basically Soldier Boys from the boys. I'm not even going to put any effort into it, even when it came down to the shield. Except when it came onto the shield, it wouldn't be like an American eagle or like a bald eagle. Instead, it would have the Japanese flag on it, or the Japanese animal, Japan's national animal, or whatever you want to call it. That's the sort of thing that would be on the shield. Izuku would also find out that they were going to be doing heroes versus villains that day, and Izuku would be rather pumped. He was excited, and he would find out that he was going to be on the hero side with this kid, Mineta. He was on a team with Mineta Minora. He was already annoyed. He was already annoyed that this kid was still here at UA. And then he found out that he also had to deal with this kid being on his team. Yeah, nah, this kid totally wasn't going to hold him back, right? Yeah, nah. Yeah, Zuko already could predict that this kid was going to hold him back throughout this whole fight. So he would literally just tell Mineta to just sit down, sit tight, and Zuko would handle everything. Mineta, he would have been like, okay. He would have been actually pretty down for that. And the fact that he didn't even make any sort of argument against it already said enough about Mineta in Zuko's eyes. He basically saw Mineta as worthless. He was born with a quirk, and he could potentially make that quirk strong, but he didn't put any effort into it whatsoever. Like, the more Izuku learned about Mineta, the more he despised him. And then Izuku also had to deal with his incompetent foes for this battle. His incompetent foes were basically like the tail guy and like this frog girl. Alright, at least with the frog girl, he could see some potential in her. Like, she had a frog mutation quirk. Alright, he could get behind that. It wasn't like the best sort of quirk out there, but at least there was some usage for that quirk. Like, she could stick to walls or whatever. Well, like, she was no spider girl or anything, but like, at least there was some practical use to that quirk. That was something that Izuku could apply her for. But the tail guy, he literally saw nothing in it whatsoever. So as soon as Izuku went up to deal with the villains, he would easily dispose of Ojiro. Ojiro? Or Ojiro. He would just easily dispose of Ojiro. Oh, I keep on saying Ojiro. You know, screw his name. Of tail guy. And when it came on to Tsuyu, he would literally just bash her with his shield. He would literally just throw his shield at her, and literally just keep it on her the whole time until he went to go and touch the bomb, which that's literally how easy it was for him to deal with those villains. It would have been a really lackluster fight, in all honesty. He wished he could have fought Bakugo or someone instead, but hey, at least he won that fight. He wouldn't have seen Tsuyu struggling to lift that shield off of her, and Izuku would just walk over and grab it, lifting it off of her right after. She would have been breathing heavily. She would have looked at Izuku in fear at just how strong he was to be carrying that hunk of metal around like it was nothing. Just how strong was this kid? But Izuku, he would just have a fake smile on his face the whole time. He would try and keep up public perception that he was a really good guy or whatever, and that, yeah, he would try and just keep up perception. He knew that he was lying through his teeth. He knew that he was basically putting up a fake front. He was just putting up a front the whole time in order to make it look like he was a genuinely good guy. But in all honesty, he honestly just wanted to crush each and every last one of his classmates in a battle, just to prove that he was the strongest. And then when you saw this kid with candy cane hair, like half of his hair was red and the other half was white, he just came in and walked through the building like he was a boss, and then he just No, he didn't even walk through the building. He just told his teammate Shoji to stay back, and he just froze the entire building like it was nothing that time around. Izuku would have been in awe, just seeing how powerful this kid Todoroki was, and to find out that he was the son of the number 2 hero of Japan. He already knew that was his rival. He needed to take down Todoroki. He needed to show Todoroki that he was the stronger of the two. The fact that Todoroki could accomplish something so amazing with minimal effort was impressive to Izuku. He wouldn't even lie. But he needed to make sure that this kid didn't steal all of the spotlight away from him. Bakugo's fight would have also been really lackluster due to him not really having that strong of an opponent to deal with. He would have just pretty much clobbered all of his opponents, and Izuku would have seen the disappointed look on Bakugo's face as well. He would kind of smirk because Bakugo had that same feeling, that same desire to fight somebody strong and show that he was superior in that way. Izuku could understand where Bakugo was coming from. He wanted to prove that he was the strongest after all, but he could not do that. He could not do such a thing if he was going to be dealing with these plebeians, these weaklings. The next day, Aizawa would have actually came into class, and he would have mentioned how he actually took a look at the kids fighting, or like the combat skills just yesterday, and he would actually applaud Izuku on the fact that he was able to deal with his opponents as fast as he did, although he did reprimand the boy a little bit on the fact that he didn't let Mineta help him whatsoever. He mentioned that they were supposed to be a team in that fight, and the fact that they were supposed to be a team meant that they should have also found a way to at least cover each other. Izuku, it would have been fine if Mineta was right beside him, making sure to cover his back in case one of the villains managed to try and do a sneak attack on Izuku, but no, Izuku didn't even bother to do that. He just saw that he didn't really need anybody's help, and that was going to get Izuku killed one day. As for Bakugo, he was just too much of a hothead. And that was pretty much it. That's pretty much all Aizawa really had to say for those two. He would talk about the others' performances, but he would also bring up the issue of, finding somebody to be their class president. And many people, they would immediately try and elect themselves. Many people would try and mention how, they should be president, I should be president, they should be president, he should be president, she should be president, all that sort. But Ida would have been the one to actually put structure into all of it. He would have mentioned how they should do a vote for who should be the class president. And the fact that people didn't really know each other all that well right now meant that it would be less biased. Everybody would have understood where Ida was coming from, and it actually did indeed sound far more structured. Honestly, when it came on to Aizawa, he didn't care how they did as long as they got it done by the end of class. So Aizawa would wake up to find that, all of the kids, they voted for a good amount of people, but the one who got the most votes was actually Izuku for his charismatic personality, although that was more for front than anything. Many people didn't really know it, but Izuku was a really big Drake at this point in life. And, and the whole thing is, he was also really strong, like really, really strong. Ridiculously strong, as a matter of fact. The only reason why I didn't select Todoroki was because of the fact that he just seemed to be too cold towards the rest of the students, and they didn't want to deal with a class president like that. As for Momo, she would have actually ended up being the vice president of the class. And many of the kids, they would have actually been fine with this result. Izuku would have especially been very fine with this result. He would have actually been very happy that he got class president. As for lunch, basically, Izuku would have just been talking to some of his classmates, mentioning how he has a really strict training regimen in order to make sure that he doesn't fall far behind. A lot of them would have been writing this down, but Izuku would have just been laughing internally, knowing that his training regimen, it's not at all what he was telling them. He was literally just going to burn these guys out if they were actually going to try this training regimen. Sure, he could probably do this, but that's only because of his unique physiology at this point. As for the others, he wasn't all that sure. He wasn't all that uplifting of a person, although he did try and fake a charismatic personality for the camera. And well, for like the students for right now anyways. But eventually Izuku would have had enough. He would just tell the kids how he wanted to eat his lunch because, well, a body like this needs a lot of calories. Obviously they would have backed off, but right when Izuku was about to eat his meal, all of a sudden an alert would go off mentioning how a Class 3 threat managed to break into UA. Or well, like somebody managed to intrude. Look. Basically, an alert would have gone off that there were intruders on campus. Many of the kids would be fearful, mainly higher ups. Second and third years, they would immediately go rushing out to the building, wondering what was going on. They were trying to rush out to the building. They were trying to leave the cafeteria, and they would have ran out in a large pile of students, or like. Basically, it would have been like a large crowd. A large crowd of students would have been rushing out of the building, or at least the cafeteria, and they were trying to leave the building as well, thinking that villains managed to make their way onto campus, but that wasn't necessarily the case. Izuku would have looked through the windows at one point, and he would have realized that no, it was actually just paparazzi, news reporters, and he would have used a commanding voice in order to tell the kids that, hey, you guys are acting ridiculous. You know that, right? You do understand that, we literally are hero students. We are literally being trained to deal with these sort of situations, and you guys are running around like headless chickens or whatever, chickens with no head. And for crying out loud, bro, you literally did not even look out the window. If you actually looked out the window and actually evaluated what was really going on, you would have understood that it wasn't actually villains that were out there. It was just a bunch of news reporters that managed to break into UA. They were trying to get an interview with All Might. That's literally it. Many of the students would actually relax hearing that, and they would walk peacefully back to their classes. Izuku would have been praised by his fellow classmates for what he did back there, because a lot of his classmates are actually getting trampled on at one point or another because of this huge crowd of people, this huge sea of individuals running away like some scaredy cats or whatever. Izuku have just soaked up all of the praise. He adored all of it. He adored being seen as strong and seen as a sort of leader, essentially. So when it came time for the USJ, many people would have been admiring Izuku at this point. They would talk about his quirk, or what they assumed was a quirk, and mention how Izuku, although his quirk was kind of weird, well, not weird, it's more so like this. Izuku's quirk reminded them of All Might, essentially. And Izuku would actually mention how he definitely admired All Might. He admired All Might by a lot. The only issue is that he's just not as strong as All Might yet. His goal was to become as strong as All Might and to become the #1 hero. Many people looked on in awe hearing that. They could definitely see it in Izuku. He had that same charismatic smile. Everything about Izuku just screamed charismatic, and he seemed to be like a clone of All Might, for crying out loud. Or like, not necessarily a clone, but more like somebody that was going to be All Might's successor. Izuku definitely had what it took to become All Might's successor, in terms of becoming the new #1 hero or whatever. But when it came on to people like Bakugo and Todoroki, although they had flashy quirks, their personalities weren't all there, you could say. That was pretty much going to be the main thing holding those two back, or at least that's what Tsuyu's conclusion was. The kids were gotten off of the bus, and they would end up going to the USJ to meet up with 13, who would mention how destructive their quirks could be, how dangerous their quirks could be if they were used in the wrong hands, which was why they were going to be doing rescue training today, so that they could learn how to handle their quirks more properly in these sort of situations, where strength did not necessarily matter, but the ability to use them to save people was what really mattered. But they wouldn't even be able to complete that because of the fact that a strange portal would appear. Kirishima would have mentioned how UA seemed to really have it all. They even had fake villains coming to the USJ, for crying out loud, but Aizawa would be confused until he turned around and saw this strange portal with these strange people coming out of it, and then he would have realized these aren't fake villains. No. He would have told everybody to get back and get behind him right now, because these were real villains. These were not fake villains whatsoever. Many of the kids, they would start panicking all of a sudden hearing that. They couldn't believe that actual villains had managed to make it into the USJ. 13 would have tried to also help handle these villains, but they would have ended up literally just getting their back blown out by Kirigiri, because of the fact that they were able to just use their word gate in order to use 13's black hole quirk against her. Many of the kids would actually be horrified seeing this, and they didn't really know what to do in this situation besides try and defend themselves. A lot of the kids would actually be teleported to different areas. Izuku would be one of the few that did not get teleported though. This was because of the way that Izuku moved. Izuku was just very fast as an individual and very strong as well. He was able to actually find Kirigiri's main body and hit it before he could actually get teleported. He would have thrown the shield at Kirigiri's main body, and this would severely injure Kirigiri because of the fact that he wasn't used to getting hit by such a strong attack from something so heavy. And Izuku would go on to and get down from the stairs, or not even the stairs, just the area. He would have just went to accompany Aizawa in his fight against the villains, and he would have taken down a good couple of villains. Aizawa would have been upset at the fact that Izuku wasn't listening to him. He was upset with the fact that Izuku should have been with 13, but for some reason the kid decided to come down here and help try and take on some villains that were beyond his pay grade. he was still a student after all, and Aizawa was a licensed hero. Aizawa should have been the only one helping in this situation. He didn't want Izuku to get hurt after all, but Izuku would have mentioned how he had this all handled, and he would continue to show that he was still rather capable. Sure, he was a student, but he was incredibly strong, an incredibly strong student. Aizawa just had an erasure quirk. He could only erase people's quirks, but what about the people with mutation quirks? Aizawa would have mentioned how he wasn't just a one-trick pony, and he would have shown his own combat skills, which would actually impress Izuku. He needed to learn a thing or two from Aizawa when it came on to hand-to-hand combat, because he actually looked at even All Might's way of fighting. He realized that it wasn't all that. He was literally just using his strength for the most part. He actually had extremely wide attacks, but the only reason why All Might was able to get away with it was because of just how strong and powerful he was, and how fast he was as well. So even if he had very wide attacks, it wouldn't really matter in the long run because nobody could actually counter in enough time. As for Izuku, although he was fast and very strong, he was not All Might's level of strong just yet. That's something he was working on. Izuku would pretty much end up just taking down most of the villains until he ended up having to deal with the Nomu, and Izuku actually struggled with the Nomu, the main reason for this being because this creature was built to take beatings from All Might. Izuku was able to sustain some damage on the Nomu, but the Nomu was able to injure Izuku as well. It would have been a long, heated battle, and Izuku would have ended up just stalling for the most part until Ida managed to get away and, well, end up recruiting some more heroes. He would have ended up actually getting backup for Izuku, essentially. And All Might would eventually arrive as well. Izuku would have worn down the Nomu at least a little bit, and All Might would have handled the Nomu from there. He would have also took care of the rest of the villains within the facility. And the unfortunate part of it all would be when discovering that two of his classmates, they didn't make it. Suyu and Mineta, they were, well, killed by the villains. This would have been a very humbling moment for Izuku. He wasn't used to death. He would have realized right then and there how fragile life could be, even if you have a quirk. He never thought about it that way before. Now Izuku had to change his mentality about quirks. He understood that although he had a very powerful ability, there were still more people who could take him down. That Nomu was giving him a good beating back there after all. And then you saw what happened to Suyu and Mineta. If he never trained in order to become stronger, he wasn't even sure if he could even hold a candle to that Nomu. The only reason why he was able to survive for so long was thanks to his shield as well. But now Izuku was questioning, where does he go from here? Where does he go now? Now, when we last left off, it would have been at the USJ, more specifically after the whole well, villain raid on the USJ, and in the aftermath, Izuku would have found out some disturbing news, some very heart-aching sort of news, you could say. This would, of course, be the death of Minoru Mineta and Suyu Asui. Although he didn't know them all that well, they were still his classmates at the end of the day. This would have affected Izuku's mentality quite a bit. He was unnerved to find out that they were dead. This was the first time he had heard about somebody actually dying, somebody so close, you could say. This hit home for Izuku, and from there on, Izuku would be forced to adapt, you could say. Adapt to this new situation of his. When it came on to the sports festival, it would have been cancelled after everybody found out the news regarding the two deaths at the USJ. UA would have been hounded by the news outlets, media. They would have been slandered. Their name would have been dragged across the mud, but they would still try and keep face. They would have cancelled the sports festival, sure, but that wouldn't mean that the students wouldn't continue their hero training. Instead, what would happen is that the kids at the at least the kids in the hero course, I should say, they would continue to train, this time even harder than ever. The teachers were not going to be as gentle with their training as they used to be after the whole death at the USJ, or the deaths at the USJ. The teachers would have realized that their kids had grown too weak, or well, not necessarily weak, more so that they needed to be trained to an extreme amount. These villains were becoming too crafty. These villains were evolving in their ways of dealing damage to hero society. The fact that they would even go on to attack children was an all-time low. They never thought about this ever before. So now they were going to crack down on their training 100 times, a hundredfold. And Izuku, he would have been all up for it at this point. He would have understood the value of life at that moment, and he did not want to go down like Suyu and Mineta. He wanted to strive forward. He wanted to essentially honor their names in a way. The fact that they ended up giving up their lives in the USJ, or not even really giving up their lives. The fact that they tried to become heroes, and in the end what ended up happening is that they were too weak. They could not defend themselves against the villains that were there at the USJ. That just showed how much more Izuku had to train to keep his head above the water, and the fact that he had to battle with the Nomu and he was struggling as well showed just how weak Izuku really was. He didn't want to feel weak whatsoever. He disdained ever having to feel weak again, and he would also try and push this ideology onto his classmates as well. He wasn't going to be selfish with this ideology of his from now on. From now on, instead of believing that he was going to be top-notch superior to everybody else, he was going to try and uplift his classmates in a way. But Izuku's way of lifting up his classmates would have been quite brutal, you could say. Day in and day out, Izuku would be found training in the Gamma Gym or any sort of gym within the UA campus. Around this time as well, UA would have adjusted their school to be a dormitory, you could say. Basically, the students would live inside of the UA campus. And Izuku, he had no issues with this. This just meant that it was going to be even easier for him to get his training in, and considering the equipment that UA had, this was going to make training much easier for him, because back at home or back at Dagobah Beach, there wasn't that much that he could really train with over time. Sure, he had a bunch of junk, but UA was just 100 times better. and he would basically drag some of his classmates into the Gamma Gym with him. He would make sure that they got their own piece of training as well, although most of them they would be exhausted from this sort of training that Izuku had in mind for them. Sometimes they would be too sore to even really participate in the training exercises that the teachers would have for them the very next day. And the teachers, as I've established before, they weren't necessarily going easy on the kids either. This would have caused some of the students to feel fatigued. This would have caused some to actually suffer some injuries along the way from this overtraining, you could say. Their bodies were being exhausted. They were being torn down to the bone. They were under the wire when it came on to training, and then they also had to focus on their academic skills as well, which it was a struggle at times because sometimes these kids they just were too tired to even focus in class, and the teachers they weren't going to just let these students slide anymore. They understood everything. They weren't trying to be too rough on them, but at the same time they had to understand that in this new society of theirs, nobody was going to hold their hands in battle. If they were going to go into battle, they needed to make sure that UA was going to provide the Hero Society with the best heroes possible. And considering the deaths of two of the students already, that already meant that they had to buckle down on their training. The students understood this as well, but still, the fact that they were going so hard on training and then Izuku coming in as well, it just made everything even more difficult than it already was. Eventually, the students would be given a break of sorts. This break would be in the form of allowing them to do an internship with some heroes for a week. This was going to be their first time going out ever since, well, the USJ. It had been months, really, and the training had been intense, but now they were finally allowed to go to all of these different heroes to gain another form of understanding for training, learning how to use their quirks, all that. And when it came on to Izuku, he would have looked at the options he was given. Many of the heroes would have been given stats regarding the students, and looking through Izuku's stats, many heroes they actually wanted Izuku as their, well, intern, you could say. They wanted Izuku to be under their guidance for the week. They had no idea what sort of personality Izuku had, but even if they were aware of how, well, I don't even know how to really describe his personality, how diligent you could say Izuku was, how hard-headed at times Izuku could be as well, how strict on training, all of these different aspects of Izuku's personality at this point in life. Some heroes may have been a bit wary of Izuku, but most of them would still probably choose him. And in the end, Izuku would have went down the list, and he would have chosen Gang Orca. He had a mutation quirk, and he was one of the top 10 heroes at the time anyways. He was close to the bottom, but he was still a top 10 hero. Izuku wanted to intern under him for that very reason. He had a mutation quirk, he was strong, he was in the top 10. In all honesty, it seemed that this was going to be the best option for Izuku. He had a great amount of strength, he was aware of that, and his combat skills were superb as well. And although people may have judged him for his looks, he didn't let that bother him whatsoever. Izuku respected that. This was exactly why he selected Gang Orca out of all of the heroes on the list. His respect for Gang Orca was pretty high at this point, and when he came on to training with him as well, he would understand that this man was quite diligent in his training as well. Izuku liked this guy. This training would have been intense, but Izuku liked the intensity of it. He felt as if he needed this intensity, this intense sort of training in order to get anywhere in life. Gang Orca would have realized something off with Izuku, and that was his intense desire to train. He was a workaholic, he would have realized at this point, and he would try to console Izuku about this. He would try and get down to the bottom of why Izuku was like this. It was almost as if Izuku had a form of OCD when it came on to his training, as if he had to be perfect in everything. And Gang Orca, he would find out that Izuku used to be quirkless, and the death of Tsuyu and Mineta also affected him as well. He would try to explain that this wasn't necessarily his fault. Their deaths were because of the villains, and Izuku wasn't there at the time to even protect them. But Izuku one time, he would actually snap at Gang Orca as well. He would explain that that was the whole point. He wasn't there to protect them. He wasn't there to protect his classmates. How is he ever going to be a hero if he can't protect two people that needed his help that day, and he couldn't save them? What kind of hero could Izuku call himself? But Gang Orca would also explain that All Might, the #1 hero, can only save so many lives as well. He's not everywhere. There are many lives that end up being lost because All Might isn't there. And he has to understand that he's still human. Even All Might has suffered with these issues before. The fact that he can't be there to save everybody, but at the same time he has to understand that he is human. He's not some omnipresent god or whatever. No, he can only be in one place at one time. So it would be best to save as many lives in that area as possible. And don't let the deaths of others affect him too much. Just use that as fuel and motivation to become better. Never become complacent. These words would stick with Izuku for a while. These words wouldn't have been basically all up in his mind at this point. After the internship was over, Izuku would have found out even more disturbing news. This, of course, being the death of Ida to the likes of Stain, the hero killer. And Izuku, at first, he would have been upset. He would have been angry at himself, the fact that he couldn't be there to save his classmate. But he would remember the words of Gang Orca, not to let that affect him that much. There's always going to be somebody that dies because he's not there, or any other hero. But he can't let those deaths affect him because he is only human, and he can only be in so many places at once. He can only be in one place at one time. And it's not Izuku's fault that one life may have slipped out of his hands. If they're on a whole other continent, if they're in a whole other area, it's not Izuku's fault. And Izuku has to understand that. Izuku would just sigh and meditate on these words. He would try and let these words form him moving forward. And of course, when it came on to their practice after their internships with the heroes, Izuku would have shown his new combat skills. He didn't really gain that much in terms of physical abilities. No, he would instead have learned how to calm himself. Actually, he would have learned how to have more of a calm mind in terms of battle, and when it came on to treating himself. And even his classmates would have noticed this difference in Izuku, his destructive nature, you could say, or his OCD. I'm not even quite sure if this is really OCD or not. You guys can correct me in the comments. I don't want to be labeling somebody with a certain, disorder when they actually don't. But basically, Izuku's issues when it came on to training, they would have still been there, but his classmates, they would have noticed that he was a lot calmer in terms of that training as well. Sure, he may have dragged them over to like Gym Gamma many times still, but even then, that training was a whole lot less harsh than before, and they could actually appreciate Izuku for that. They liked this new Izuku, although he was still rough around the edges. This they could handle a lot better, you could say. Eventually, they would have their final exams, in which the students would find out that they would be participating against the teachers. They had to fight in a 2v1, essentially, and their whole goal was to either capture the villain, that being the teachers, or escape. Izuku would have been paired with Bakugo. The two would also have to be going up against All Might. The teachers would have recognized Izuku's incredible strength and combat prowess, and they would have figured that he would have been good to go up against All Might. Same for Bakugo, actually. And they would have also recognized that these two seem to have a bit of a disdain for each other. Going back to even middle school, they would have found out that these two went to the same middle school, and for the longest, Izuku was labeled quirkless. And seeing how Bakugo had even made remarks about Izuku's quirkless nature, the teachers would have figured out that this would have been the perfect matchup to really test these students. And of course, Izuku would do his best to just avoid Bakugo for the most part. He wouldn't be trying to fight All Might. He would have recognized that All Might was too strong for him right now, so he would have tried to escape, and despite that, All Might would have been there to stop him multiple times. Bakugo would have been there to also try and combat against All Might, thinking that he could possibly get the win somehow, but Izuku would have called Bakugo an idiot multiple times for even trying to go up against the number one hero, even if he had a handicap on him. Just because he had a handicap in terms of the strength department didn't necessarily mean that his durability also went down as well. All Might was still incredibly strong with that handicap, and his durability was just as high as ever. He could take a whole lot of punches, and he would just be able to eat them. He would be able to dish out one punch, and Bakugo would have been splattered all over the walls if he went all out. Naturally, All Might wouldn't go all out, but you get the point. Izuku would have used this time to think about plans in order to just escape, until he realized that Bakugo would just be the perfect distraction for All Might. Izuku would have grabbed Bakugo at one point and dragged him over to a corner. He would explain his plan to Bakugo, in which the explosive plot would have just called blasphemy, mentioning how Izuku was a scaredy cat. Of course, Bakugo would be the one that would have to fight All Might. He was the stronger out of the two after all, so it made sense. And Izuku would have just ignored Bakugo's last comment. He already knew that he was stronger than Bakugo. The only thing that Bakugo had over Izuku was range. Izuku had more strength. He had raw strength because of his quirk, and he had incredible speed. But in terms of combat, Bakugo had a medium to long range quirk. He could even use his quirk in close combat as well, technically. Something that Izuku did not have. The closest that Izuku had was, well, his shield. But even then, that was... It was a bit iffy at times. It would be better for Izuku to use the shield to protect himself from injuries. That was pretty much it. Bakugo would go on to fight All Might once again, going all out this time around. He would have even gotten rid of his grenade gauntlets, and he would have tried to fire explosions as big as possible, although they would end up messing with his arms, his wrists. You get the point. But Izuku, during all of this momentum, all of this energy that Bakugo was using up against All Might, he would have used this distraction in order to slip by, and Izuku would of course be able to make it to the finish line. All Might would be surprised. He would have thought that Izuku would have also tried to fight him, but no. It seemed as if Izuku had wised up over these past couple of weeks since internship and recognized that he was at a severe disadvantage when it came on to fighting against All Might, so he would have went on to do the next best thing, and that was to try and escape. Using Bakugo as a distraction was interesting as well. He would have never thought that Izuku would do that, considering the amount of pride he once had, but it seemed as if the USJ and the internship really did humble him. Bakugo would have been a bloody mess, and he would have actually been extremely exhausted as well, but he would just be happy over the fact that he managed to win against All Might, albeit not necessarily in the way he wanted. He wanted to beat All Might in a fist fight, but he understood that he still wasn't going to be strong enough to do such a thing. And if this was the closest he got to being All Might, then, well, so be it. The next issue would arrive when it came on to the mountain training arc. You see, Aizawa would have told the kids that when it came on to this whole Asana thing, the hot spa, yeah, it turns out that was a lie. Those who failed the final exams were still going up to the mountain lodge for this summer, but there was another catch. This wasn't going to just be a hot spa or, well, just some play area. No, none of that. They should have known better anyways. What's really happening is that this whole situation is regarding, well, training. The kids were going to be training up in the mountains for the summer to get them right for when it came on to next year, when it came on to getting their provisional hero licenses. Although some of the students would groan, Izuku would have just stayed silent, listening, and he would just not respond whatsoever. He would have just accepted his fate. He had no issues with training after all. He was a workaholic at times, but he had become better, you could say. And on the bus ride to the mountains, Aizawa would strangely stop the bus in the middle of the forest. Many of the students would actually get off the bus, well, actually all of them, wondering just what was going on, until a woman in blue introduced herself as Pixie Bob and slammed her foot, not her foot, but her hand on the ground floor. All of a sudden, the ground began to shift and morph into these weird dirt monsters. Izuku's classmates would have immediately recognized what was going to be happening, and they weren't in the mood for this whatsoever. They would try and flee the scene. They would try to get back on the bus, but Aizawa would have been long gone. Izuku wouldn't even bother trying to catch up with the bus either. Sure, he could probably run after it, but if Aizawa noticed him, he would probably just step on the gas a bit more. And although Izuku was fast, he was only so fast. He couldn't really keep up with a moving cart that was going, say, 150 miles per hour or something. Like a moderate speed, more like 45 miles, all that sort. He could probably keep up with that. But there was only so much, you get the point. Izuku and his classmates, they would go on to be forced to fight off these dirt monsters, and a lot of them would have been a breeze for Izuku. He would have just slammed his shield into most of them, or thrown his shield at a lot of these dirt monsters, and he would have grabbed his shield afterwards. He would have also punched through a lot of these dirt monsters, and so would many of the other classmates as well. Eventually, they would have been tired out from all of this fighting. Although Izuku would have still been standing strong, he was, well, a super soldier, to an extent. Well, not even to an extent. In a sense, he was a super soldier. And he was basically conditioned to handle these sort of things better than most people, most quite individuals. When they finally made it up to the mountain lodge, Izuku would have still been standing strong, which would impress the hero team. You know the name. I'm not saying it. But a lot of his classmates, they would have just collapsed to the floor at this point. They were exhausted beyond comprehension. They were only really still breathing and conscious because of the over excessive training that they had been doing previously at school or in their dormitories. The heroes would just look at the students and just they would honestly just tick at the students, mentioning how their training was going to be a whole lot harder from here. The students, most of them, they would just immediately fall unconscious hearing that. And the next day, Izuku would have woken up to a loud sound. He would have immediately gotten up alongside the rest of his classmates. They would have been all pretty confused, wondering just what was happening, until Aizawa arrived in their rooms, explaining that they were going to be training their quirks today. They would have been even more confused now, until Aizawa went and grabbed a ball. He would have chucked it over to Izuku, and he would make a request for Izuku to throw it. Throw it outside. Throw it as far as possible. Izuku would do so, and Aizawa would clock in a score that was moderately higher than his, beginning score, the one at the beginning of the school year, but it was a whole lot less than what most people were expecting. They were expecting for Izuku to have hit, say, 100, 200, shoot, even maybe 300 more meters than before, but no. Izuku only managed to do it like about 30 to 40 more meters. That was about it. Which Aizawa did mention that was rather impressive. But he also mentioned that Izuku did have like a physical strength enhancing quirk, so in training, in any sense of the word, it would probably increase his strength as well. It could, his physical training, it was just going to help strengthen his quirk overall. Izuku was kind of a bad choice, and he would have thrown the ball over to Katsuki Bakugo next, and Bakugo, he would have had even less improvement as well. And Aizawa would mention that, see, notice the difference here? You guys seem to be under the impression that your quirks got stronger over all this training period, but as a matter of fact, we've just been doing a whole lot of physical training. We haven't really been training your quirks. Sure, you may have gotten a couple new skills while using your quirks during all of this training, but when it comes on to the overall strength of your quirks, they're still lacking. What good will your quirks be in real life, in a real life battle against villains, if your quirk strength is still only comparable to that of, say, a middle schooler? Which a lot of the class would take offense to, but Aizawa would immediately hush them up, mentioning how that they needed to increase the strength of their quirks during this time at the mountain training, or the mountain lodge, whatever you want to call it. And that's precisely what all of them would end up doing. When it came out to Izuku's training in particular, he would have been lifting all kinds of things. He would have gone on to lift some boulders, and he would have went on to lift teachers, students, just lift as many heavy things as possible, and then to move around with them as well. Run, as a matter of fact, sometimes. And despite how heavy some of them were, Azuku would put in his best effort in order to run as fast as possible and for as long as possible as well to build up his endurance. His physical endurance would be something necessary alongside his speed for the future. He needed to be able to keep up with his villains and keep up for a very long time. He couldn't afford to get winded very soon, very fast. If he were to move at his top speed, he couldn't just be too winded immediately after, I don't know, 5 seconds. And even if Izuku had the conditioning of a super soldier, that was really only going to get him so far. Your physical endurance, that's something that still needs to be built up over time. And that's precisely what Aizawa would be having for pretty much all of the class, really. Same for Class 1B as well, when it came on to their training with their teacher as well. Nobody was going to be given any freebies in this situation, and this would be what the whole classes would be doing for the time on the Mountain Lodge. No villains would actually attack in this timeline, considering the fact that the main reason they came to attack the Mountain Lodge was because they wanted Bakugo. They had observed Bakugo for a while, and how he acted in the USJ. It was befitting of a villain more than a hero, and they wanted to capture him to also demotivate the heroes as well. But after everything that had happened recently, they didn't seem to really have any need for that. They had already demoralized the heroes one time when it came on to the deaths of Suya and Mineta, and then another time with the death of, well, one of the Idas, literally a hero child, you could say. Or basically this. Tenya Ida came from the Ingenium family, a family full of heroes, and yet he died. The media, I didn't even mention this before, but they were all over UA for this death as well. They chewed out UA harshly. They criticized the methods of their teaching. Just how exactly were they really teaching their students if they were just going to be dying left and right? Some parents were really considering taking their kids out to the hero course as well. Some of them actually would, at least for Class 1B. They didn't want to risk that. They didn't want to risk any sort of bad luck being passed on to them, although they may have still had their 20 classmates in number in terms of prestige or whatever, but they were afraid that they would get 1A's cursed soon, very soon. They didn't want to risk losing their children at such a young age. And that's why some of them would be removed from the class. When it came on to 1A, it would take a lot of convincing, but most of them would actually still stay in the class. It was just the weaker ones like Ojiro and, Ojiro and Invisible Girl, you can say. They were the main ones that were being taken out of the class. After the training at the Mountain Lodge, the US students would go back to the campus and they would go on to learn how to create super moves, basically to market themselves. And this would be also in preparation for the provisional hero license exam. Azuku wouldn't really know what to do besides maybe mimic All Might's punches, but All Might would give him some more tips, mentioning how he didn't have to fight in the exact same way as him. And Azuku would think back to how he trained with Gang Orca as well, and he would try and mimic some of Gang Orca's, style. He would try and mimic the style of multiple heroes, actually, until he managed to create his own form of style. Something that was a mix of many heroes and martial arts, but also in a way that adjusted to his own build. Something that adjusted to the way that he used his quirk and the fact that he also had his shield with him most of the time as well. These would have been his super moves. I'm not listing them out. Nah, forget that. You all can be creative enough. It honestly didn't take long for the hero license exam to arrive. It honestly felt like it had only been a day since they had been training their quakes. And no, not even just a day that they've been training their quakes. It only felt like yesterday that these kids just finally made it into the UA, and now they were going to get their hero license exams. Azuku and his classmates, they would have been worried. They would have been a bit nervous, but they wouldn't let this nervousness distract them. They would do their very best, and throughout all of it, Azuku would surely end up getting his hero license exam. Well, oh my goodness. Izuku would, by the very end up making it to the end of the hero licensing exam, and he would have been one of the people to gain his, license, his provisional hero license. And he would also go on to end up having an internship with Night Eye, apparently. This guy seemed to be rather interested in him. And and when it came on to the motivational part as well, Azuku would have met up with the big three. Not only Azuku, but many of his classmates as well. They would have ended up meeting the big three of UA. This being, of course, Mirio Tagata, Tamaki Amajiki, and Nejire. And Nejire, I forgot her last name. Was it like Hado? No, like Nejire Hado or something? But Mirio, he would have noticed the unenthusiastic faces on many of the students' faces when it came on to internships, and hearing the whole issue of what happened before, of course, this being the death of Ida when it came on to the last internship that they had, he would have understood why they weren't really all that interested in interning once again. But this time, with licenses, meaning that they had less restriction on what they could do. So Mirio would try and show them the light side. They would go on to have a bit of a spar, and this spar would have literally just been Mirio wrecking everybody. Azuku would have been the best shot against Mirio, but even then, at the very end, Mirio would have still been able to get a number on Azuku. Azuku would have been rather sturdy of an individual, and Mirio would have complimented Azuku for that, recognizing that just punching him wasn't going to be enough, and he would go on to power up in a sense. Azuku could notice immediately something was off about Mirio when he just stopped, permeating through the floor and going back up, like using his permeation quirk or whatever. This was different. It was as if he had two quirks, and Mirio would have sucker punched Azuku, and this punch would have sent Azuku flying. Azuku would have ended up landing on his back, and he would have gasped for air. He would have been rubbing his jaw as well. He wasn't expecting for Mirio to be so strong. And many of the students in Class 1A would have recognized this as well. It was no mere feat to just be able to knock Azuku back like that. It took some of the strongest individuals within Class 1A to even leave a scratch on Azuku with how durable he was. But yet, Mirio managed to just land one blow on Izuku and send him flying? Just how strong was this guy? That's how a lot of these guys were literally thinking at this point. Many of them wanted to know how strong Mirio was. They would have been crowding around him, wondering just what his just wondering what sort of quirk he had, and Mirio would have explained that his quirk was permeation, which it sounded cool at first until he explained the whole issue of him basically becoming deaf to the world, deaf and blind to the world. He had to develop a sort of echolocation when it came onto his quirk in order to just be able to use it properly. He was not born with a strong quirk. He made it strong. And when it came onto what Mirio did with Izuku, he explained that he learned another neat trick about his quirk recently, and that was that he could build up a certain amount of kinetic energy while bouncing around, and he would have used this kinetic energy in order to send Izuku flying. Well, in actuality, it was not. That was not the case whatsoever. That was just some lie he made up on the spot. Many of them wouldn't have known that. Well, Mirio was actually the ninth holder of One for All at this point in time. Seeing just how strong Mirio was, this would have also interested Izuku, and you would also find out a bit more about Mirio. This, of course, being his whole ordeal with Sir Night Eye, and that's how we end up in this current situation, where Zuko finds himself, well, interning under Sir Night Eye. This next internship would be rather strange for Zuko. It seemed as if Sir Night Eye was a very meticulous sort of person. He was strict. He also seemed to like jokes as well. This guy seemed rather confusing to Izuku. This guy seemed so serious, but at the same time he had a tickle machine. Was this guy into what he thought he was? No, that can't be. There's somebody so pristine or like prestigious as Sir Night Eye. There was no way that guy had that sort of kink, right? Ah, well, it wasn't his business. He supposed that every hero had their kinks, but that wasn't something that Izuku was going to get himself involved in. Instead, he was just going to learn more about how to be a hero, and he would have gone to patrol with Mirio. They would have ended up encountering a little girl, though, on the way. This little girl had some issues, though. She had bandages all around her arms, and there was this seemingly call for help with the way that she just jumped into Izuku's arms and just grabbed onto him, mentioning how she didn't want to be let go of. This way that she hugged him, it was in fear as well. Until this one guy managed to walk out to the corner. He would have explained that he was this little girl's father, and that she was a bit of a klutz. And that was the whole reason why she was bandaged up. The whole reason that she ran away in the first place was because she got in trouble and she didn't want to take the punishment. They probably understood that this was just what a father had to deal with when it came on to their child. But Izuku could immediately smell Cap. Izuku knew what a good father was like, and he already could tell that this wasn't a good father. This guy didn't even look like Eri whatsoever. He showed no resemblance to this little girl whatsoever. He also looked rather young, which was kinda suspicious in Izuku's opinion. A lot of things were pointing to the fact that, well, this guy wasn't who he claimed he was. And Izuku had mentioned that, okay, since he was their father, then they should have no issue taking a blood test or anything. Eri would try to wiggle out of Izuku's arms, recognizing just what, well, Chisaki was about to do. And she didn't want Izuku and Mirio to get hurt for the sake of herself. But Izuku would have just grabbed tighter onto Eri. He wasn't going to let this little girl slip out of his hands. No. He had already lost too many lives already. He wasn't going to let another life be lost, just because of something out of his control. He recognized that this little girl needed saving, and this was the one time he actually had things under his control. The first time that he actually felt like he could actually do something in order to save somebody. There's no way that he was going to call himself a hero and let this little girl just be dragged back to some sort of hellhole, because the way that he was acting and the way this guy talked, it was unnatural to Izuku. So Izuku, he would try and flee the scene with Eri, although when it came on to Mirio, he would try and stop Izuku, mentioning how they needed to return the little girl to her father. But immediately after Mirio said that, large spikes would immediately begin to form around the vicinity. Izuku would have immediately been too agile as well. Izuku would have, well, let me repeat that. Let me rephrase that. Izuku would have immediately recognized these fast approaching, well, spikes, and he would have jumped into the air. He would be rather fast. He would have also been rather, well, let me just say this. Izuku could jump good. Izuku could jump really good. He was able to grab onto a brick building and climb up with Eri in one arm. Sure, he also had his shield in his arms as well, but it was okay. He was able to handle the weight. And they were able to just run for the most part. They were just running around the whole place. Eventually, Mirio would just have to put an end to Chisaki, though. He would knock out Chisaki, and they would basically have this guy locked up for a while. So Night Eye, finding out what ended up happening, would actually be rather furious with Izuku for his recklessness in the situation, but he would sigh and also mention that he supposed that this recklessness was kind of good in this situation, considering the fact that Izuku and Mirio managed to capture a high-level Yakuza member. This was actually the current leader of the Yakuza, and Kachisaki, also known as Overhaul. And they've been trying to get some date on this guy for the longest. And they've been looking at this little girl, Eri, and her medical records were rather strange. On top of that, they also noticed some DNA of Chisaki on her. She seemed to be harmed in many places along her arms. The way that they unwrapped the bandages and noticed the amount of scars on the little girl's body at such a young age was kind of terrifying to many of the doctors, and they would go through a close examination, realizing that Chisaki's quirk had some sort of, well, effect on her. Many signs were showing that Chisaki seemed to have had an effect on Eri. They would go on to also have a bit of an interrogation with Eri as well. They would question just exactly what Chisaki did to her over the years, and they would have also made sure that, well, the best detective at the time, the one that was friends with All Might, Sukaichi, I believe his name was, he would be the one to actually interrogate Eri for the fact that he had a quirk that was able to detect lies, and throughout all of the statements that Eri gave, he was only able to detect a couple of lies that are being made just to protect Chisaki out of fear of what would happen. But in the end, they were able to relieve Eri, and she would come clean, mentioning just how horrific of an experience that she ended up having over the years. And this information would have been enough to lock up Chisaki, and they would have also gone on to do the same for the rest of the Yakuza members. They would have had an all-out raid that, well, the very next week they would have recruited as many heroes as possible in order to have a raid against the Yakuzas. And they would have also found out during this time that the League of Villains was also being allied with, well, the Yakuza, they would have managed to take down quite a number of Yakuza. Some may have managed to escape, but for the most part, they were able to take down a whole organization, a whole underground organization. And when it came onto the League of Villains, sure, they may have managed to get away for the most part, but they wouldn't manage to get away for very long because, well, from there on, over the years, Azuku would have continued to grow in strength and power. He would have made sure to avenge his classmates one way or another, and by the end, Azuku would have been powerful enough to rival All Might in terms of strength. All Might would have continued to diminish in terms of power, but he would have also found out about the existence of All For One. All For One would have still been alive at this time, and he was still trying to recuperate. He was hoping to eventually get his hands on Eri so that she could rewind his body back to its prime, but it seemed as if that wasn't going to happen anymore. And All Might would have also managed to find All For One's location. The two would have duked it out, and although All Might was rather weak at this point, he was still far stronger than All For One overall. Just when All For One thought he was going to be getting the advantage when he hit All Might in his weak spot, he would have ended up getting bombarded by punches from Mirio Tagata and, well, Azuku Midoriya, also known as Soldier Boy. Mirio Tagata would have also been referred to as Lemillion at this point. Both of them would have had their hero licenses, and they would have been full-fledged heroes at this point. These two would have duked it out against All For One, and the fact that these guys were both practically as strong as All Might, if not stronger at this point, this would have been enough to pretty much take down All For One, and his whole organization would have began to crumble from there. Sure, some of them may have tried to escape, but they would have had GPSs managed, not necessarily GPS, but tracking devices would have been placed onto some of these villains thanks to the efforts of Creati, also known as Momo Yaoyorozu. And overall, pretty much all of the villains, they would have been defeated. Azuku would have had a confidence boost over this time. He would have become far stronger, and he would have also used this time to, well, take down these many villains. He would have gone for many days taking down villains without rest. And although Mirio mentioned that this was kind of unhealthy, Azuku mentioned that he just needed to get this sort of relief. He needed to protect many people, and he was going to rest soon. He just wanted to take down as many League members as possible. And Mirio would let Azuku just go on. He would just let Azuku go off from there. Azuku would have taken down pretty much the whole League of Villains. Not necessarily by himself, but a good amount of them would have been taken down by Azuku alone. Others would have been taken down by his classmates or other heroes. But in the end, what really mattered was that the League of Villains would have been no more. And unfortunately, Mirio Tagata, the number one hero at this point in time, would have died a few years later from some sort of terminal illness. They didn't necessarily know what was the whole cause behind it. All they knew was that Mirio died for some reason, and Izuku would have ended up becoming the next number one hero. One for All would have died with Mirio, and Izuku would not have been aware whatsoever of the quake. All he knew was that Mirio was a great hero, and that he was somebody to look up to. And Izuku would continue to look up to Mirio, All Might, Gang Orca, all of these heroes that helped to form Izuku into the person that he was to this day. And he had also managed to become less violent. He had learned to overcome his former issues. He had learned to become a better person to his teammates. Although sometimes he would be a bit too pushy with his teammates, he had become better. And this is how we basically end the story. So yeah, that's basically what if Deku was Soldier Boy. And if you guys think that there should have been something different to have happened, let me know in the comments. Let me know your interpretations of how the story should have gone, all that sort of information. Just leave it down in the comments. And if you like the story, just give it a like and maybe even share it. If you've been rocking with my content for a while as well, shoot, maybe, I don't know, subscribe. And click that notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos. But yeah, that's basically all I have to really say. It's your boy Kintai Next saying out. Peace!